They had marched across Europe with arrogance. Soldiers of Hitler's once unstoppable war machine. They'd seen cities crumble under their boots, believed in the supremacy of their Reich, and laughed at the idea that anyone could outmatch German engineering or discipline. But then they were captured, shipped thousands of miles away across the vast Atlantic, into the heart of the very country they had been told was weak, lazy, incapable of matching the might of the fatherland. And when those German prisoners of war stepped off the trains onto American soil, what they saw shattered everything they believed. Factories stretching to the horizon, endless convoys of trucks, tanks, and planes, cities untouched by war, thriving, glowing with neon and life. America's industrial strength wasn't just real. It was something beyond imagination. This is the untold story of how German POWs were stunned by America's overwhelming power, and how that shock forever changed the way they saw the world, their enemy, and even themselves. By 1943, the tide of war had turned. The German war machine, once the terror of Europe, was crumbling under the relentless weight of Allied firepower. The surrender at Stalingrad had broken the myth of invincibility, and the Allies were tightening the noose on every front. As Allied troops advanced through North Africa, one battle would seal the fate of tens of thousands of German soldiers, the Battle of Tunisia. Surrounded, outgunned, and cut off from supply lines, General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's Afrika Korps finally laid down their arms. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers, Germans and Italians, were captured in what was one of the largest mass surrenders of the war. Among those men were thousands of proud, battle-hardened German soldiers, soldiers who had fought in scorching deserts, who had lived on ration crumbs, who had been taught from birth to believe that Germany was the center of civilization. As they were lined up and marched into Allied custody, many still carried that pride. They were prisoners, yes, but in their minds they remained superior. The journey that awaited them, however, would soon humble them in ways they could never have imagined. At first, they were told they were being sent to prison camps, but not in Britain or North Africa. Instead, rumors spread among the captured ranks. "We're going to America." Some scoffed. Others were excited. A few were terrified, but no one really understood what that meant. America to them was a fantasy, a country of farmers, jazz music, and movie stars, too soft to fight a real war. They had been told that Roosevelt's America was weak and divided, that it lacked the discipline and power of Germany. But as the ships that carried them left the Mediterranean and began crossing the Atlantic, whispers began. The food was good. The guards were polite. The ship was clean, efficient, and huge. It didn't match the image they had in their heads of a collapsing, chaotic enemy. When they finally caught sight of the American coastline, the towering cranes, the endless rows of factories, the massive ports filled with steel and smoke, their first glimpse of the United States hit them like a thunderclap. The myth began to break. As the German POWs disembarked at American docks, many in New York, Boston, and Norfolk, the silence among them was deafening. They saw something they had not seen in years, a country unscarred by war, no bombed-out ruins, no desperate civilians, no ration lines. Instead, bustling streets, massive cars, overflowing food markets, smiling people. While Europe starved, America thrived. They were marched to waiting trains, trains so smooth, modern, and efficient that even the most disciplined German soldiers couldn't help but whisper among themselves. So this is the land of lazy workers? The trains carried them deep into the American heartland, through vast fields of wheat and corn, past roaring factories, over bridges built from solid steel, across landscapes that seemed infinite. In their eyes, this wasn't just another country. It was an empire built not on conquest, but on creation. When they finally arrived at the POW camps, scattered across Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and the Midwest, they were stunned once again. These weren't brutal prison camps. The barracks were clean. They were fed well. Some camps even had recreation, libraries, and sports. Many of them expected to be humiliated or beaten, but instead they were treated with surprising fairness. Some even received pay for work done inside the camp. It was a shock that disarmed them more effectively than any weapon. In the evenings, when the guards relaxed and the prisoners gathered to talk, a single question began circulating among the ranks. How did we ever think we could beat this? For the first time, cracks began to appear in the mental armor of the Nazi faithful. Propaganda had told them that Germany was the pinnacle of progress, that America was decadent and inefficient. Yet here they were, living proof that they'd been lied to. Some POWs wrote in secret journals about their disbelief, describing trains that ran like clockwork, food that seemed endless, and a civilian population that lived in comfort unimaginable in war-torn Europe. And as the days turned into weeks, admiration began to grow, grudging at first, then genuine. For many German POWs, America was becoming a paradox, an enemy they could not hate. But their astonishment was only beginning. Soon, they would see the full scope of America's industrial might, a power so vast and efficient that it would make even the most loyal Nazi soldier question everything he thought he knew about war, about strength, and about truth itself. Because soon they would see the factories, the assembly lines, the machines that built the arsenal of democracy. And for the first time, they would understand why Germany lost the war long before its armies ever surrendered. The long journey from the battlefields of North Africa to the heart of the United States had already left the German POWs in a state of quiet disbelief. But what awaited them inside the country's industrial engine would break through even the thickest walls of Nazi indoctrination. In the months following their arrival, many German prisoners were assigned to work programs across rural America. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested corn in Nebraska, and cut timber in the forests of Arkansas. Others were sent to repair roads, maintain railways, or work in local factories that supported the American war effort. These were not forced labor camps like the ones they had seen under their own regime. The POWs were paid modest wages, treated fairly, and even allowed to buy small luxuries from canteens: cigarettes, soap, candy, and sometimes even beer. At first, the Germans were cautious. They expected propaganda. They assumed it was a trick, a carefully staged illusion meant to impress them. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the truth became impossible to ignore. Everywhere they looked, America was moving, alive with an energy that felt endless. The POWs were stunned to see ordinary American civilians, including women, operating enormous machines, assembling aircraft parts, and driving trucks loaded with supplies. They had been told women were fragile, unsuited for hard labor. Yet here, women in bandanas and denim worked fearlessly alongside men, covered in oil and sweat, building the planes and tanks that were now crushing Germany on every front. Many German soldiers later wrote that this sight changed them more than anything else. The German war machine had always been rigid, disciplined, hierarchical, and ruled by fear. But America's strength seemed to come from freedom itself. Workers laughed, played music, and spoke openly, yet production never slowed. They worked not because they were ordered to, but because they believed in something. And that belief fueled a kind of unity the Germans had never understood. When the POWs saw factories like Ford's Willow Run plant, capable of producing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, they were left speechless. In Germany, every bomber required weeks of precision labor, tightly controlled and monitored by officers. But in America, vast assembly lines ran day and night, producing aircraft, tanks, and ships in quantities that defied logic. The POWs had thought Germany was the most industrially advanced nation in the world. Yet this was something else entirely. They saw locomotives thundering across the plains, pulling endless trains of military cargo. They saw convoys of trucks rolling out in perfect coordination, carrying ammunition, food and fuel to every corner of the country. They saw mountains of raw materials, steel, aluminum, copper, being melted, shaped, and forged into weapons faster than any army could destroy them. America's power wasn't just in its machines, it was in its scale, its rhythm, its unbreakable confidence. Some POWs began to ask their guards questions. How can you produce so much so quickly? The Americans simply smiled and said, "We've got a lot of people who care." It was such a simple answer, yet it struck the Germans deeply. Their entire system had been built on fear and obedience, but America's was built on cooperation and belief. As they worked side by side with American supervisors, the prisoners began to notice something else that confused them. They were treated with respect. There were no beatings, no shouting, no cruelty. If a man did his job well, he was praised. If he made a mistake, he was corrected, not punished. This was unthinkable in Hitler's army, where failure was a crime. At night, when the day's work was done, the POWs sat in their barracks, talking quietly under the dim lights. The conversations were no longer about returning to Germany in glory or about Hitler's promises of victory. Now they spoke of what they had seen and what it meant. "How could a country like this ever lose?" one of them whispered. "They never believed the lies we were told," another said softly. They believed in themselves. Some of them began sketching what they had witnessed: vast factories, powerful locomotives, women at workbenches, to remember and show their families back home one day. By 1944, as the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, more German prisoners arrived in the United States, filling hundreds of POW camps across the country. Many of the new arrivals still carried arrogance, the belief that Germany's technology and discipline were unmatched. But when they met those who had been there longer, they heard new stories, stories of factories that never stopped, of a nation so large and strong that the war could never truly reach its heart. Slowly, disbelief gave way to understanding. The shock was not only industrial, but cultural. German soldiers couldn't comprehend how a country filled with people from different races, religions, and backgrounds could work together so efficiently. They had been taught that unity came only from purity, that strength required sameness. But here, America's diversity was its strength. In one camp, a German officer who had commanded hundreds of men on the battlefield admitted to a fellow prisoner, "We were told they were soft, but we were wrong. This country is the real Colossus." Letters written home by German POWs, carefully censored by American authorities, carried a tone of awe. Many described the abundance of food, the kindness of guards, and the astonishing scale of industry. One prisoner wrote, "If Germany had seen this before the war, no one would have dared start it." Yet amid the admiration, there was something else: shame. Some of the older soldiers began to realize how deeply they had been deceived. They saw the contrast between what they were told to fight for, domination, fear, control, and what America represented, freedom, creativity, and opportunity. For the first time, they began to question not just the war, but the ideology behind it. And as the months went by, a transformation began to take root inside those camps. When the war finally ended in 1945, these German POWs would be sent home, but they would not return the same men. Many of them carried back with them not bitterness, but a strange sense of gratitude, and a story that no one in Germany would believe until they saw it themselves. Because what they had seen in America wasn't just an enemy's land, it was a glimpse of the future, a vision of what human progress could be when it was powered by freedom instead of fear. By late 1944, the German POW camps across America had become small societies of their own, miniature worlds filled with paradoxes. Behind barbed wire fences stood the same men who had once shouted "Heil Hitler" in perfect unison, who had marched through Europe with the conviction that Germany was destined to rule the world. Yet now, those same men woke up every morning to the sound of country music on an American radio, ate hearty breakfasts of eggs and bread, and went to work in a land that seemed limitless in power and kindness. What had begun as shock was turning into something deeper, a quiet awakening. Inside the camps, a transformation was taking place, one that no amount of Allied propaganda could have engineered. It wasn't forced re-education or humiliation that changed them. It was the slow daily experience of living within the beating heart of democracy. The American guards, many of whom were young farm boys or factory workers, treated the prisoners with a casual friendliness that confused them. They laughed, joked, and even shared cigarettes with the Germans. To the POWs, this behavior made no sense. Back home, enemies were to be despised, crushed, or executed. But here the enemy shook your hand, asked about your family, and sometimes even shared stories about their own lives. It was disarming. At first, some of the die-hard Nazi officers tried to maintain control within the camps. They lectured, held secret meetings, and threatened punishment for any prisoner who fraternized too much with Americans or questioned Hitler's ideology. In several camps, small groups of true believers tried to enforce discipline through intimidation, labeling anyone who expressed admiration for the US as a verrater, a traitor. But the tide was shifting. One by one, men began to ignore the threats. They had seen too much to continue believing the lies. They had seen Americans working hard but living free, women building bombers and voting in elections, black workers contributing to the same war effort as white soldiers, things they had been told were impossible under inferior systems, and yet here it all was, thriving before their eyes. Some of the POWs even began learning English. They asked guards for books, Mark Twain, Hemingway, and the occasional history volume. They wanted to understand the mindset of the people who had built such a nation. The more they read, the more they realized that America's strength wasn't just industrial, it was philosophical. It came from the belief that every man mattered, and that idea that's so alien to men raised in the authoritarian culture of Nazi Germany began to take root in their minds. By the spring of 1945, as word spread that the Third Reich was collapsing, the atmosphere inside the camps grew tense. The die-hard Nazis became desperate, their authority crumbling as news trickled in through guards and radio broadcasts. Rumors of Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender soon reached the prisoners. Some refused to believe it, others wept quietly. But for most, it brought a strange, heavy silence, not only grief for their homeland, but confusion about what awaited them next. Would they return to ruins? To families they hadn't heard from in years? To a Germany they no longer recognized? And beneath all of that uncertainty was another thought, one that none of them could admit aloud. Would they ever see this land again? For all its fences and watchtowers, America had felt freer than the world they came from. Here, even prisoners had dignity. Even enemies were treated as men. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the U.S. government began preparing to repatriate over 370,000 German POWs held in camps across the nation. But before they left, something remarkable happened. In camp after camp, American guards and local civilians organized small farewell gatherings for the prisoners. There were handshakes, photographs, and sometimes even tears. Farmers thanked the Germans who had helped them harvest crops. Factory owners praised the men who had worked diligently beside them. For many Americans, these men were no longer Nazis. They were just people, young, far from home, and victims of a war they hadn't chosen. For the German prisoners, those goodbyes were emotional and bewildering. They had been taught to expect hatred, vengeance, and punishment from the Allies. Instead, they received kindness, respect, and compassion. One prisoner later recalled, "I came here thinking Americans were our enemies, but I leave thinking they are our teachers." Another wrote in his diary, "I fought for a Germany that no longer exists, but I have seen a country that shows me what humanity could be." As the trains carried them back eastward, toward the ports that would take them to a shattered Europe, many German POWs stared silently out the windows, watching the endless fields and cities pass by. Some pressed their faces to the glass, trying to memorize it all, the landscapes, the lights, the people. It wasn't the enemy's land anymore. It was something like a mirror, a reflection of what their homeland could have been if it had chosen a different path. When they finally boarded ships bound for Europe, the air was thick with emotion. Some men hummed softly, others prayed. A few carried small tokens, an American cigarette lighter, a photo with a guard, a book of English phrases. These were their mementos, reminders of a chapter that had changed them more than any battle ever could. Back in Germany, what they found was almost unbearable. The cities were rubble. The streets were filled with orphans and widows. The mighty Reich had vanished, leaving behind hunger, chaos, and guilt. For the men returning from American captivity, it was like stepping from a dream into a nightmare. Many of them spoke softly to others about what they had seen, but at first, few believed them. How could the enemy have been so generous? How could they have seen such abundance and freedom when their families had been starving? Yet slowly their stories spread, and with them, an idea began to grow in post-war Germany, that the future could be built not on domination, but on cooperation, that democracy and industry could coexist, and that lesson, planted in the hearts of those German POWs, would later shape the very foundation of Germany's rebirth. Because many of those men who returned from American camps went on to become builders, teachers, and engineers in the new West Germany, a nation rebuilt on the principles they had once fought against. The prisoners, who had once sneered at America's softness, had discovered its greatest strength, the power of freedom guided by conscience. They had seen the arsenal of democracy and realized that the real victory wasn't in the weapons, but in the spirit that built them. When the ships carrying the German prisoners of war finally reached the shores of Europe, the men who disembarked were no longer the same soldiers who had marched away years before. The salty Atlantic wind that hit their faces felt colder, harsher, and it carried the scent of a homeland in ruins. Their boots stepped onto soil that once promised glory, but now only whispered defeat. The docks were silent except for the creaking of ships and the muffled weeping of families who had gathered to see what remained of their loved ones. For the first time, the returning POWs saw their nation stripped bare, cities reduced to skeletal ruins, fields scorched and empty, children begging in the streets with hollow eyes. The men who had once served under the black and red banner of the Third Reich stood in disbelief at what had become of the fatherland. Berlin was a ghost city. Entire neighborhoods were gone, bombed into oblivion. The Reichstag, once the symbol of German power, stood shattered, its dome broken like a skull. In many towns, there were no roofs, no shops, no music, only the sound of crows circling above the debris. For the POWs, it felt as if they had returned to a different planet. The American camps, with their fields, farms, and fair treatment, had become almost like a dream, something that existed in another lifetime. They had gone from warm meals and steady work to rations of thin soup and sleeping in the ruins of what used to be their homes. Yet, as strange as it seemed, many of them carried something within, a seed planted during their time in captivity. They had seen what industry could look like when it was used not for conquest, but for creation. They had seen a system where men could argue with their leaders and still live free, where workers could rise to success without pledging loyalty to a dictator. And slowly, quietly, they began to share these memories with others. At first, people didn't want to hear it. Germany in 1946 was a land of bitterness and shame. Many still clung to old propaganda, refusing to believe that America could have been kind or just. But as the months passed, the returning prisoners began to influence the rebuilding of their communities. They told their neighbors about the efficient American farms, where machinery replaced exhaustion, and where productivity was matched by fairness. They described the vast factories they had seen, humming like living creatures, with assembly lines that produced wonders at a speed unimaginable to Germans. They told of how even the smallest American town had libraries, electricity, schools, and roads that seemed endless. And more importantly, they spoke of freedom, not as chaos or weakness, but as strength. Many of the ex-POWs became interpreters, engineers, or labor organizers during the American occupation. Their English skills and familiarity with American ways made them valuable in rebuilding projects. The U.S. officials overseeing reconstruction were often surprised by how cooperative and thoughtful these former enemies were. They didn't realize that many of these men had been transformed not by ideology, but by exposure. The Marshall Plan, America's massive economic aid to rebuild Europe, arrived like rain after a drought. Factories were repaired, railroads restored, and new homes built. The returning POWs often served as mediators between local workers and the Allied administrators. They helped explain to fellow Germans how American systems worked, the balance of industry, democracy, and dignity. And while they labored to rebuild their shattered nation, they also rebuilt something deeper, their faith in humanity. One former soldier named Karl Weiss, who had spent 3 years in a POW camp in Texas, returned to his small hometown near Frankfurt. When he found his family gone and his village half destroyed, he didn't sink into despair. Instead, he organized the townspeople, gathering tools, setting up workshops, and teaching others how to repair machinery. He told them, "If America can build from nothing, so can we." Within 5 years, the town had its first electric mill, its first rebuilt school, and a small library, all inspired by the example he had seen in captivity. Across Germany, similar stories emerged. Former POWs were becoming quiet revolutionaries, not with weapons, but with ideas. They had witnessed a nation that had achieved greatness without tyranny. They had seen churches filled not with political banners, but with community spirit. They had worked beside men who didn't care about bloodlines or rank, only effort and skill. These memories became the moral blueprint for the new West Germany that would rise from the ashes. The irony was striking. The same men Hitler had sent to conquer the world were now helping rebuild their homeland using lessons learned from the very country that defeated them. By the early 1950s, West Germany began to experience what historians would later call the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Factories hummed again, cities came back to life, and young people spoke of opportunity instead of war. While much of the credit went to the Marshall Plan and German efficiency, there was an invisible influence behind it all. The mindset carried home by hundreds of thousands of former POWs who had lived in America's shadow and returned carrying its light. In interviews conducted decades later, many of these men would recall their time in captivity not with bitterness, but with gratitude. They spoke of American guards who treated them as equals, of farm families who had shared meals with them, and of the shock of seeing shelves full of food when their own families starved. For them, America had become not just an enemy, but a model of what was possible when freedom and compassion worked together. Some even emigrated back to the U.S. after the war, drawn by the same fascination that had begun behind barbed wire fences. Others stayed and dedicated their lives to education, politics, and industry, determined to shape a Germany that would never again fall to hate. Through them, America's spirit quietly seeped into the heart of post-war Europe, not through conquest, but through understanding. By the end of the decade, a new generation of Germans was growing up with different dreams. They spoke of peace, prosperity, and democracy. The scars of the war were still visible everywhere, but so was hope. And that hope had been planted unknowingly in the minds of men who once swore to destroy it. The irony was almost poetic. In defeating Germany, America hadn't just won the war, it had won the hearts of its former enemies. But there was one final layer to this story, one that historians rarely discuss: the emotional scars, the guilt, and the silent burden those POWs carried as they tried to rebuild their lives. Because even as they embraced new ideals, many of them were haunted by memories of what they had done and what they had believed. That reckoning, the moral awakening, would define the rest of their lives. The years after the war stretched into decades, and as time passed, the German prisoners of war who had once labored in the fields and factories of America began to grow old. Yet inside them, the memories of that strange captivity never faded. The world had changed, cities rebuilt, borders redrawn, ideologies shifted. But the lessons they carried home from their time in the United States remained etched in their hearts like scars that never truly healed. When they returned home in the late 1940s, many of them were young men in their 20s. By the 1960s, they were fathers, teachers, engineers, and tradesmen, helping to rebuild a nation that was still learning how to breathe after total destruction. To their children, they were ordinary men, working hard to provide a better life. But beneath that quiet exterior lay an extraordinary truth. They were the living bridges between two worlds, the defeated and the victorious, the broken and the free. Some of them spoke openly about their experiences in America. They told their families about the kindness of the farmers who treated them as humans, about the efficiency of American machinery, and the dignity of a system that didn't rely on fear. Others, however, could not bring themselves to talk at all. They carried guilt, not only for fighting in a war that had destroyed millions of lives, but for surviving it when so many others had not. There were nights when they would wake up sweating, hearing the roar of bombers or the crack of rifles in their dreams. They remembered comrades lost on the battlefield and the faces of civilians caught in the chaos. And yet those same men also remembered standing in American fields, watching endless rows of wheat under a blue sky, feeling for the first time in years that life could be more than war and death. It was a paradox they lived with forever, shame and gratitude, loss and rebirth. By the late 1950s, West Germany had begun to thrive. The factories roared again, the economy surged, and the scars of war began to fade beneath the glitter of modernity. But in the quiet corners of towns and villages, the men who had been POWs became the unspoken moral backbone of the new generation. They had seen the world outside the Nazi bubble, and that vision shaped how they raised their children. They taught them humility instead of arrogance, cooperation instead of domination. They taught them that strength didn't come from conquest, but from compassion. And most importantly, they taught them to never forget how easily a nation could be led into madness if it allowed hatred to rule. One man named Heinrich Bauer, who had spent 4 years in an Oklahoma camp, became a teacher in Hamburg after the war. In his classroom, he never mentioned his past as a soldier, but his lessons always carried a subtle message about tolerance, peace, and the importance of questioning authority. When his students once asked him how he knew so much about America, he smiled softly and said, "Because I saw it when I had no freedom of my own." Others followed similar paths. Former POWs became small-town mayors, engineers, mechanics, and craftsmen who emphasized precision and ethics over propaganda. They weren't heroes in the traditional sense, but they became quiet reformers, shaping the new Germany not through speeches or politics, but through daily examples of decency. In 1964, nearly 2 decades after the war, a reunion was held in Texas for former POWs who had been held at Camp Hearn. To everyone's surprise, several German veterans traveled across the Atlantic to attend. They were welcomed by the same American families they had once worked for. Hugs replaced handshakes, tears replaced suspicion. One man, who had picked cotton on an American farm during the war, stood on the same soil again and said through tears, "This land taught me what it means to be free." These moments became powerful symbols of reconciliation, proof that even from the ashes of hatred, humanity could grow. But not every story ended with peace. Some POWs never recovered from the psychological fracture of captivity and defeat. For them, the return home was a second imprisonment, within their own minds. They found themselves alienated in a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had fought for. Some couldn't find work, some turned to alcohol, and others lived in silence until their deaths, unable to reconcile what they had believed with what they had learned. And yet, even their silence told a story. Because in post-war Germany, the absence of glorification, the refusal to boast about wartime service, became a quiet form of repentance. By the 1970s, historians began to uncover the broader truth. The experience of captivity in the US had been one of the most significant cultural exchanges in history. Over 400,000 German POWs had lived and worked across America between 1942 and 1946. They had seen the inside of the world's most advanced industrial nation, one built not on dictatorship, but on democracy and individual freedom. When they returned to Germany, They carried those impressions back like invisible blueprints for the future. It was this generation, the ones who had seen both fascism and freedom firsthand, who quietly helped shape Germany's modern identity. They influenced how schools were rebuilt, how workplaces were managed, and even how Germans viewed America for decades to come. During the Cold War, when West Germany aligned itself with the United States against Soviet expansion, it wasn't just politics, it was personal. For many, it was a continuation of a relationship born in the strangest of circumstances, in captivity. As the years went on, some of these men began writing memoirs. One book, A Prisoner in the Land of Freedom, published in the 1980s by a former Luftwaffe pilot named Hans Schreiber, told how he had arrived in Texas hating Americans and left admiring them. In his words, "They defeated us without hatred, they conquered us without humiliation, and in doing so, they taught us what true victory means." That single line would resonate deeply with readers across both nations. By the time the last of the former POWs passed away in the early 2000s, Germany was a thriving democracy and one of the world's economic powerhouses. The transformation was complete, not just industrially, but morally. The nation that had once worshipped destruction had learned, through its own sons' experiences, how to build, to heal, and to coexist. Their legacy was not written in medals or monuments, but in the quiet progress of a peaceful nation. They had witnessed the best and worst of humanity and chosen to carry forward the better part of it. And perhaps that was the greatest irony of all, that the men who had been sent to destroy America ended up helping Germany rebuild itself in America's image. Their story stands as one of history's most profound paradoxes, that sometimes the deepest lessons in freedom come not from victory, but from captivity. As the last surviving POWs faded into history, a few of their descendants began visiting the very camps where their fathers and grandfathers had once been held. They walked among the remains of barracks now overgrown with weeds, touched the rusted fences, and left small flags or letters in remembrance. Many said they came not to mourn, but to give thanks, to honor the strange, improbable friendship that had turned enemies into teachers. And so, as history's pages turned and generations changed, the legacy of those men endured, not in the sound of guns or the roar of factories, but in the quiet heartbeat of peace. Because sometimes the most powerful stories of war are not about who won or lost, but about who learned.